Hi, this is Rafael Chacón, Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture and a Professor of Art History and Criticism at the University of Montana. Welcome back to my series called The Professor Speaks, and we are on the topic of Roman art. We are in our fourth lecture on Roman art. So without much ado, we shall begin our conversation. So let me start the PowerPoint very quickly and share the screen. Bear with me a second while my PowerPoint comes online. Here we go. And we will begin. So we are in our fourth discussion and talking about that transition from the Roman Republic, which was already an empire, to it's a dictatorship. And what begins with in the years after the death of Julius Caesar is in fact the origins of the Roman dictatorship. Remember that the term dictatorship comes from dictator, which is a Latin word for leader. And Caesar chose that term for himself, and then that's the term that would later be used by not just a succession of Roman emperors, but also all kinds of despots particularly in the Western world after the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. So we have what begins with Caesar and then his heir, Caesar Augustus, is a series of rule by one man and an individual who has absolute power over the Roman state. And really, it's Augustus who sets forth that paradigm because, again, just as a reminder, Caesar did not rule for very long before his assassination. It was left to his heir, Augustus, to become that first dictator, true dictator. And he ruled for a very long time, and he ruled very successfully, thus creating the paradigm that we know today of the strongman. And we have known in the world, particularly the Western world and even its colonies, have known this concept of dictatorship well into modern times. So let's go ahead and get started today. And incidentally, before we do, I do want to talk about a particularly good source for this period in Roman history, that is the transition from Caesar to Augustus, from the Republic to dictatorship. There's a wonderful British series called Rome. If you haven't seen it, I think it's close to now 10 years old, but it's superbly acted, and it's also and very well scripted and historically accurate in many, many ways. But what's wonderful about that series is the atmosphere that it creates. You really do feel like you understand and recognize all the inner workings of the Roman Empire, from the lowest classes to the highest. You understand the chicanery, the corruption of the court and the upper classes and the ruling houses of Rome, all the way down to the needs and the conditions of the average person. And you also have a sense of the atmospherics of what the ancient city must have been like. So it's a marvelous, marvelous production. I highly, highly recommend it. And it's, of course, it's a piece of popular culture, but it's really well done and particularly well researched. So Rome, don't miss the series. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our discussion of the primus inter pares, the first among equals, Augustus. So what you have on the screen is a series of important dates in Augustus's life. So he was born in the year 63 before the Common Era, before the date 0, and he ruled from 27 BC until 14, the year of the Common Era. So he had a long and relatively prosperous rule, although it was not always so. I mean, initially he had to establish power and concentrate power as the heir to Julius Caesar. And again, he dies of natural causes in the year 14. He was the son of noblemen Octavius and Attia. And Attia was a niece of Julius Caesar, a daughter of a woman by the name of Julia. And in 45 BC, at the height of his power, Julius Caesar adopted him as his legal heir. And then after Caesar's death, in 44 BC, Augustus gained power. And then, of course, he had to consolidate power because it wasn't a given that one, that dictatorship would survive, and two, that it would be Julius Caesar's heir to be that person in power. There were other contenders for the idea of the dictatorship. And there were also all those Republicans who wanted the old order to persist, the old Republican order. So Caesar's enemies, including people like Mark Antony, Lepidus, etc. But apparently in 43 BC, Octavius, who we later would call Augustus, and I'll go through his names shortly here, but would form a triumvirate, that is a rule by three. So they divided the empire into three parts, and again, I'll show you a map of that. And he ruled with Mark Antony and Lepidus as quasi-allies. He ruled over Africa, Sardinia, Sicily, and Italy proper. These men ruled other parts of the empire. But there was always a friction there. And in fact, there was a civil war that developed between these leaders. The biggest rival to Augustus would be Pompey, Caesar's old ally, and then turned enemy. And then Mark Antony would also become an enemy of Augustus. So his claim to power was in defeating these former allies. He actually had to defeat both Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and we know Cleopatra was Julius Caesar's mistress for a while, the Egyptian pharaoh. And it wasn't until 27 BC that Augustus then receives the title Augustus from the Senate. And then he would continue to expand his power and expand the boundaries of the empire throughout his rule. And before we leave the screen, let's talk about his name. His name was Gaius Octavius, that was his given name, and then eventually it becomes Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and he would earn the nickname Caesar Augustus, and eventually just Augustus, as the Senate gave him that title. The use of the name Caesar linked him to, of course, Julius Caesar in that family. So he wore the title of Caesar Augustus quite proudly as the legal heir to Julius Caesar. He was married 3 times, and so he was married, and again, these are marriages of convenience, marriages of power. Very short marriage to Claudia from 42 to 40, Scribonia from 40 to 38, so marriages that only lasted 2 years. And then finally, a marriage to Livia Drusilla from 30 BC to his death in 14 CE in the Common Era. So Livia was the keeper. And we don't think of those early marriages as at all being romantic in any way. They were marriages that were basically about families, ruling families, pooling their resources, maintaining wealth and position and status in the society. Those marriages didn't last. The marriage to Livia, from all accounts, was not just a marriage of power, a power couple, but it was also they had, by all accounts, affection for each other. They loved each other. And so Livia was, in fact, his lifelong partner, and she was apparently a very good spouse and a very good spouse of the dictator. She, in fact, encouraged, supported, and helped him maintain his sense of power as the pater patriae, the father of the homeland, pater familias, the head of the family. These were very important concepts in the Roman world. So 2 maps here. The first one on the upper left shows you the second triumvirate, and you can see it's color-coded so that you can see that the green territories to the far west, including the Italian peninsula, North Africa, Spain, etc. Those were the territories ruled by Augustus in the triumvirate. And then the territories in the purple, dark and light, were the territories ruled by Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus. And then you see the map on the right after he becomes the sole ruler, the empire under Augustus. And then on the left, you have a coin, both sides of a coin that show you, in fact, where you have the likeness of Mark Antony on one side and the likeness of Octavius on the other. So an aureus, a coin that actually comes from the period of the triumvirate. Okay, and then this is another map, and I think I've shown you this in earlier episodes, that shows you the extent of the empire both under Caesar and under Augustus. The important thing here is to remember that these territories, these expanded territories, were subject to the Roman state. And of course, the majority of the privileges went to Roman citizens, whether they were living in the Italian peninsula, the city of Rome proper, or in the colonies or the expanded territories of the empire. Citizens had access to the privileges of the state, and the state would dole out the privileges to those individuals. Sometimes those citizens were Romans themselves, ex-military people, retired soldiers, etc., functionaries of the Roman state, colonizers, settlers from Rome who traveled and settled in those regions, or sometimes they were locals who were adopted and were brought into the state by given citizenship in the Roman state. Okay, so let's leave that map and turn to a couple of images of Caesar Augustus. These are very celebrated statues of the emperor, life-size, or in some cases over life-size statues of Caesar Augustus, and they show him in two different roles. So the clothing that he's wearing and the gestures indicate that we actually have him in two different guises or two different personae. On the left, we have the famous statue of Augustus of Prima Porta, which is currently in the Vatican Museum, and it shows him as a military leader. So in fact, we have him dressed in the cuirass, the outfit of a Roman soldier. And on the right, we have the statue that was found on the Via Labicana, so one of the Roman roads out of Rome. And this was him as the Pontifex Maximus, so as the high priest of the Roman state religion. So both statues show Augustus in a very, very similar likeness, but wearing completely different outfits depending on the role that they're playing. On the left, you have him as a soldier, and on the right, you have him as a priest, the high priest of the Roman religion. We'll talk more about these statues shortly. So beginning with the statue of Augustus of Prima Porta. Prima Porta, by the way, as the title indicates, is the first gate. So Prima Porta is now a town, a village at the edges of the Roman city, where there was in fact a gatehouse, and it was there that Augustus and Livia, particularly Livia, had a villa. We'll talk more about that building later. And there was this major over life-size piece of propaganda, this enormous statue showing us Augustus as a military man, as a great leader. And it is a marvelous statue, for one, because it's virtually intact. In a minute, I'll talk more about its excavation and its discovery. But first, let's talk about what we're looking at. So we see him in this corpulent, heroic, very athletic body, the body of a soldier. It may not be an accurate representation of Augustus's body type, and that's not uncommon for Roman portraiture in this period. We do have the Roman artists, sculptors concentrated on the likeness of the face, and were less accurate or less representational in their renderings of the body. The body itself was more symbolic. So he's shown as a general, yes, a Roman general wearing the clothing of the period, but more than likely he's shown as an ancient Greek athlete. So we have this kind of heroic, beautiful athletic body, a body sort of more pumped up, more muscular than what the records leave us to believe was true about Augustus. And that's okay, because the image was, as I mentioned earlier, a piece of propaganda that talked about the virility and the power of this individual, this dictator. So he originally held a staff, more than likely in his left hand, and then the hand pointing upwards is a gesture of rulership or leadership. It's almost as if he is blessing the crowd, or if he's ordering his soldiers, or he's orating in front of a crowd, and that explains the upraised arm. Notice that there's a little bit of intensity in the gaze. We'll see that shortly in a close-up, meaning that he is actually focused on his rulership and his guidance of the state. And also another little detail on this sculpture is the very important image of the Cupid, or the Eros, sitting on a vase attached to his right leg. Now, that attachment on the right leg is typical of Roman marble sculptures. Roman sculptors didn't trust the ankles of their very heavy stone sculptures. So they often attached a tree stump, or attached the leg to a tree stump, an urn, a column base, something like that, to fortify that particular, that weak joint in the marble, to make sure that the sculpture would in fact survive. And so that little angel there, the little Cupid figure, angel's probably the incorrect term, the Cupid figure, or the Eros figure, is there to support that leg. That's its primary job. But it's also symbolic. Remember all the associations with Venus, Venus Genetrix, and love, the associations with the ancestors of Julius Caesar. That is the way that symbolically the sculpture alludes to Augustus's lineage. So the theme of Mars, the soldier god, and Venus, the god of love, those two are paired even in the sculpture as a sub-theme, as maybe not an insignificant theme. Okay, and this image here shows you the discovery of the sculpture in the 19th century at the villa at Porta Prima. Here you see a bunch of individuals, Italians and foreigners, watching as the figure is being pulled out of the ground. And notice that it wasn't alone. There were many, many sculptures and columns and cenotaphs and carved monuments that were discovered in the ruins of the Augustan villa at Prima Porta. Now, let's not be fooled by what we see on the left. This is the current condition of the statue at the Vatican Museum. Scholars have noted for a long, long time that this sculpture still has pigmentation in the marble, embedded in the marble. Remember that marble is a porous material. It's a stone that can be polished smooth, but even when polished smooth, it still has small microscopic pits. And those pits actually retain the original colors of this sculpture long before it was trashed and long before it was buried. And so on the image on the right is a reconstruction of what the original color of that sculpture was like. We see Augustus's blonde hair. We see his lips colored in pink. We see the color of the cuirass that he's wearing and the robes that he wore. That's what the sculpture looked like. And historians starting in the 19th century began to reconstruct what that sculpture looked like in color. So the Roman world was much more vibrant than what we see in its ruins today, which were either by default blanched of its original pigmentation or intentionally. We know that, for example, in the 19th century, many museum directors and curators often just washed these sculptures and removed all traces of any original pigmentation. But that wasn't, fortunately, that wasn't true of this one. And on the lower right, you see the reconstruction that is in the Vatican Museum that shows us how vibrantly colored the original statue at Prima Porta was. Remember that naturalism was an important part of sculpture, not just in the form of the figure, but also in its coloration. So even the eyes were colored in to show us that he had hazel, light-colored eyes and blondish, reddish hair. The sculpture was much more vibrant than what we see today. So one thing about the portrait of Augustus that is very interesting, he is handsome. He is drop dead good looking. And that's fairly clear. And that was true. I mean, by all accounts, he was a very good looking man. And that obviously helped him in his rise to power and popularity. That's evident in this sculpture. He always wears this kind of beneficent smile, as if he's, sometimes his brow is a little bit furrowed, indicating that he's thoughtful, pensive. And that's true of a lot of Roman aristocratic bust portraits. They were thinkers, and the sculptors wanted to convey that they were in fact in thought. And often the facial expressions indicate that they're in various states of speech as well. In this case, he's not speaking, although the gesture would indicate that he's orating, but he's taking a pause in a speech and smiling on the crowd. And that's, of course, an important part of the propaganda. He thought himself as a leader, he thought himself as the father of the state, and therefore he wears a beneficent expression on his face. What is remarkable is how consistent the portraits of Augustus are. There are thousands of them throughout the empire. It's as if the state itself were cranking out images of this leader. In the same way that we have images of our kings and our presidents on the walls today, the Roman world was populated throughout the colonies with images of the dictator. And what is remarkable about the images of Augustus is how consistent they are. There is a standard likeness, and it's almost as if the emperor himself chose to be depicted in this way. And then what we have are multiple copies by the hundreds, by the thousands of that likeness. Here are two different versions of that of Augustus, one in a bust portrait, the one that's in Copenhagen there on the left, and the image of him is the Pontifex Maximus from the Via Labicana. So a full-length sculpture, a bust portrait, but they have the same face. And the other thing is that Augustus never ages. He is forever in his 30s. So he is forever at the prime of life. You will never see an image of him either as a very young man or as a very old man. And that is presumably because he had high control of his image, and he always wanted to be perceived in his best light, in his youthful vigor. So the man in full in his early 30s or his late 20s is what we see in portrait after portrait after portrait. And by the way, there is a model for that. And that model is not a Roman model, it's a Greek model. And so I'm showing you portraits of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who became the great emperor of the Hellenic Empire. And like Augustus, what we have are hundreds of portraits with the same image of him as a Nephib, as a beautiful young athlete at the prime of his life. That model seems to have been important for Augustus because it would be replicated in his lifetime. So these are just two different versions, and notice again the consistency of the likeness of the image of Alexander the Great. So in previous centuries, long before Augustus becomes dictator, there was a Greek model for that idea of portraiture. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the portraits of Augustus from all over the Western Empire. And again, look for that consistent image of him. Here he is as a younger man from sometime in the 1st century BC. And there is a coin there that you'll notice that has, again, the likeness, but in profile, as is true of most coins. Here's another one. This one is in Boston today. A damaged sculpture. The nose is broken. Part of the head of the cranium is broken. But again, it's that same smile, sometimes the furrowed brow, but a beneficent smile on the part of the youthful dictator. Some of these portraits also appear in bronze, not just in marble. And the bronze, of course, is rarer than the marble, namely because it tends to be melted down and recycled for arms and armor and that sort of thing. So bronze is was a more valuable material, particularly after the collapse of the empire. But these two remarkable ones, the one on the left from Athens, a portrait of the head of Caesar Augustus, and on the right, a remarkable sculpture that could only have been part of a much larger equestrian image, him riding on horseback. The horse is gone, but we have the upper body, the torso of the emperor from the British. It's in the British Museum today. And again, notice the gesture is similar to the one at Porta Prima, the marble sculpture of him at Porta Prima, only the arm is lowered rather than extended above the crowd. There are also images of Augustus in cameos. Now, a cameo is a very specialized form of sculpture. It's a piece of jewelry, but also a highly collectible piece of jewelry. And the cameos can be actually quite large. Cameos are made of glassy stone that comes in different layers of usually sardonyx, materials like that, that have different colored layers. And what happens is the sculptor actually carves the uppermost layer and then begins to carve down, revealing the lower different colored layers. So for example, with this famous cameo known as the Blacas cameo, the uppermost layer was white, and then you had a layer of black, and then you had a layer of reddish tone, and then you had a layer of white, and then below that another reddish layer. And this is actually a translucent material, so it's been backlit so that you can see the colors more vividly. So we have here, this is known as the Augustus Gorgoneon because there's an image of the Gorgon on his breastplate, on his shield there. Again, an allusion to the gods of the Greco-Roman world. But it's the emperor in profile, much like the coin that I just showed you, wearing a diadem across his head. Again, like a youthful athlete or youthful warrior. The Augustus Gorgoneon or the Blacas cameo. Here's another spectacular one. Vienna, the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna has a remarkable collection of Augustan gems. They call them gems, but they're really cameos. And ignore the setting. That golden setting is a much later Baroque addition to it to contain this, because this was in royal collections. It has been in royal collections as long as anybody can remember. This was owned by the Austro-Hungarian emperors in more recent times. But what it shows us is a cameo in two tiers. You have an upper tier showing Augustus being crowned by the gods and goddesses. And so everybody's there, all the important gods and goddesses. He's sitting, sort of having a council on a bench with Athena or Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, the ancient goddess of wisdom. And then down below, what you have are a scene of war. And so this is a god, or this was an emperor, by the way, who was at war for a good portion of his rule at the edges of the empire or very close to home, and consolidating his power through warfare. So the scene down below is actually an image of victory, because they're actually raising a standard of victory. And you see captives in the lower left and lower right, Roman captives under Augustus. A remarkable, remarkable gemstone. And it's actually big. I believe it is, let's see, I don't have the size on here, but it's actually a substantive piece of carved stone. This one, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, in France, is known as the Great Cameo, or the Grand Cameo of France. And it again is an Augustan theme. We have Augustus enthroned in the center of the cameo with his wife Livia immediately to his left, surrounded by members of the royal household, the court, and then in a kind of apotheosis above him in the sky. An amazing scene. You actually see the winged Pegasus on the right, and then down below, the people, his subjects, the people that were in the care of his rule. So, if there are portraits of Augustus, there are also portraits of the Empress Livia. So these are images of Livia Drusilla, one in the Pushkin Museum on the left in Moscow, and one at the Louvre Museum in Paris on the right. Fairly consistent images of her as well. Remember, the Roman portraits can be stereotypical. They could be abbreviated versions of them, kind of almost caricatures of these people, or they could actually be quite lifelike. And some of the ones that are more lifelike were presumably done from life. That is, you had the sitter right there in front of the sculptor. That's not always true. And it's entirely possible that there are a handful of works that were done from life, and then the rest are replicas of those, copies of those, imitations of those. And those can be naturalistic or can be idealized or standardized or abbreviated versions of the likeness. With Livia, it's difficult to know what's an actual likeness and what's or an actual portrait, and what's a kind of generic view of a Roman matron. So two portraits over here, and there are life-size or over life-size sculptures like this one. This is Livia as Ops, the goddess of agricultural fertility. And that's another characteristic of Roman Republican and then early sculptures from the dictatorship, where you see the rulers in the guise of an ancient deity. So here we have Livia as the goddess Ops, goddess of agricultural fertility. And of course, as the mother, as the fecund mother of her family, but also of symbolically of the Roman state, it would make sense to represent her as a god of fertility. And by the way, that one she's holding, let's see, let me back up here briefly. She's holding in one hand a sheaf of wheat or a bundle of wheat in her right hand. And on the left, she has a cornucopia with flowers and fruit, images of abundance in the Roman world, images that could be read by anyone, literate or not, as an image of fertility and abundance and prosperity under the Augustan family. Here's another one of Livia seated. This is a marvelous sculpture. This one comes from the city of Paestum, so on south of Rome, on the western coast of Italy, in the region of Campania. And this one lives today in Madrid. She moved over to the western part of the empire. So she lives in the Archaeological Museum of Madrid. A marvelous sculpture wearing the typical clothing of an aristocratic Roman matron. We don't know exactly what she held in her hands because the arm has been broken off. At least one arm has been broken off. Lots of cameos with images of Livia and Augustus, or Livia alone. This is an interesting one because it shows Livia with the bust of the divine Augustus. That the notion is that with both Julius Caesar and Augustus, that they became divinized. They themselves became gods, and the Roman state sanctioned the worship of them as deities. And we have her holding in her hand the bust of her husband, more than likely her deceased husband, as a divinized being, as a god. So Livia facing her beloved emperor. Now, I just want to shift a little bit to the architectural spaces that they inhabited. So I'm going to show you a couple of images of their home. And this is the home that is on the Palatine Hill. Remember, Rome had 7 hills. One of them was the Palatine, where eventually the palaces of the Roman emperors would be built. There were aristocrats who lived on this hill from the beginnings from Etruscan times forward. And so it made sense for Augustus to build a home there. Actually, I believe he bought a home and then had it remodeled for him and his wife. But it was not an ostentatious place. It was actually quite a humble set of rooms, not an enormous palace in the way that we think of modern royal palaces today. But what was there was actually quite sumptuous. So it was small, but it was beautifully decorated. And I'm showing you some details of the primary imagery that surrounded every room. The walls were frescoed. That is, the plaster was painted while it was still fresh. And it was painted with these architectural ensembles. So we see columns, colonnades, windows, porches, flowers, things like masks or images of deities or urns on shelves, all painted quite naturalistically, quite lifelike, to decorate the interior of their homes. Garlands of fruit hung between columns. All of this is fictional. All of this is paint. It's fresco, nature-based pigments mixed with the plaster or painted on the fresh plaster, the wet plaster, allowed to dry together to form a hard, beautiful surface for their coverings. And of course, these are fragments, these are ruins of the house, of the palace of Augustus and Livia and their family on the Palatine Hill. Here's another detail showing us the image of Apollo, so the Greek god with his lyre. Again, a handsome youth, golden-haired, long-haired, a beautiful youth playing his lyre. And by the way, many of the artists who did these frescoes in the Roman world were indeed Greeks. So they traveled, they were migratory families that traveled there. And Augustus and Julia had access, Augustus and Livia had access to the best painters in the Roman world to decorate their homes. And of course, they had villas outside of the city as well, not just in the city. And of course, Rome is a city that in the summer months becomes very hot, very humid, and almost insufferable, even if you're living on a hill like the Palatine. So the idea was to go elsewhere, out into the countryside where it was cooler, the air was fresher, not quite as stinky as it was in the imperial capital, sometimes on the shore, sometimes at the edges of a lake. This is an image on the left of a typical Roman villa, and this one is attributed to Livia and Augustus. We don't know that for sure, but it gives you a sense of the way aristocratic Romans lived in the outskirts of the city, and fleeing the city was an important aspect of their lives, at least seasonally. It was fleeing the city because of the bad air and the weather, but it was also fleeing the city because of its bad politics, its corrupt air, if you will. So, and again, an image on the lower right of the excavations of Livia's villa out at Prima Porta. And on that note, let's take a look at the remnants of that villa. And I'm showing you mostly the foundations of the building, because the superstructure, of course, has been lost over the last 2,000 years. But we do have wonderful images of the mosaic floors, that is, the floors that were composed of small chips or tesserae pieced together in mostly geometric patterns to form a hard, smooth surface. And this house was, in fact, again, modest in scale, but beautifully appointed in terms of the decoration. So beautiful frescoes on the walls, mosaics on the floor, and you can visit this house today. You can also visit a reproduction of this house in California. So if you visit the town of Malibu and you visit the Getty Villa there, the oil mogul Getty had Villas Livia reconstructed with ceilings, etc., in facsimile of the villa at Prima Porta. There was one very special room that was discovered there that was virtually intact, and that is the dining room, the triclinium of Livia's house, and that triclinium was excavated in the 19th century and then removed. The frescoes were removed from there for their protection from the villa and brought to Rome to the National Museum, the Palazzo Massimo alle Terme. And you can see that today. These were the excavations in 1863, the same time that the sculpture was excavated. And this is the room as it appeared back then. And the frescoes, and I believe this vault was actually built later to protect it. But eventually the frescoes were entirely removed, because in the 19th century they had developed a technique where they could literally roll the plaster off the walls and then reconstruct it as paintings, hang it on new walls. And that's what happened to these frescoes. They were taken off the walls, off the original walls, and then rebuilt and rehung in the National Museum in Rome. And here you see those incredible frescoes. And what it is a room, a very simple room, surrounded by a garden, a fictional painted garden. And by the way, there you see that before it was removed and brought to the National Museum. And then an image on the lower part of the screen showing us the frescoes as they were restored, cleaned, and on view currently today. You see an enclosed garden with beautiful plants, recognizable plants, roses and pomegranates, and recognizable birds enjoying the fruit surrounding them. And think about what it was like to dine in a cool hall like this out in a villa. Every evening they would dine there as the royal household and with their guests and family. Some more scenes of the sumptuous fruits and birds that surrounded the triclinium, the walls of the triclinium. Again, very naturalistically painted. And of course, the old cliche that it was so lifelike that you could pluck the fruit off the vine or off the tree. That was the intent of these artists working in around the year zero. Okay, so Augustus didn't confine the building for himself. He also built amenities for the Roman state and the Roman people. And if you remember, Julius Caesar built an enormous forum. There you see it in this diagram as L. Just off the Roman Forum, he built the Julian Forum and built a temple to Venus Genetrix there. Again, you can see that on this diagram. And again, to orient you, what you're looking at here is the end of the Roman Forum, right in the foreground here, with the Capitoline Hill on the left and its temples and buildings, the tabularium, a whole complex of structures on the Capitoline Hill on the left side of that image. The Roman Forum, of course, increasingly was built up, so it was once an open space, but it was also filled in with temples and basilicas, mostly at the edges of it, allowing the Via Sacra to wend through it. But it's at the edge of that, right behind the Curia, that's the number K there, the letter K there, where the Senate met. Right behind it, Julius Caesar had a forum built to honor his family and to honor his rule. And then adjacent to it, where you see N, Augustus would build his own forum. So again, this is a concentration of fora right off the Roman fora, the Roman Forum, that indicate the power of this family, the family of Julius Caesar. So there on the left, again, this is a close-up. We have the Julian Forum, and then adjacent to it, you would basically walk into it from the Julian Forum. You would access it. Another neighborhood was pulled down so that Augustus could build his own forum and build his own temple in that forum. So again, the structure is quite easily to see here. We have a temple, a courtyard in front of it, two colonnades running left and right of it, and then two apses, these two semicircular forms that are they form like two rooms off the side of that colonnade. And that is it. That is the Augustan Forum. But the important thing is here's the proximity between Augustus and Julius in these two fora. And again, here's this wonderful map that shows us the Capitoline Hill down in the lower left, the Roman Forum coming in on the lower right, and there is the Via Sacra there in the lower right, terminating at the Capitoline Hill. And then above it, immediately above it, you see the Forum of Julius right in the center of your screen. And then above that, the Forum of Augustus. It's a little bit bigger, interestingly enough, than Julius Caesar's Forum. And then ignore the other fora that were built left and right of that because those came along much later in time. So initially there were just neighborhoods that abutted these first two early forums, these additions to the Roman Forum. And again, the model of Augustus' Forum on the left, and then a diagram that sort of splits it so that you can see the way it was designed. And there were arches that led into the neighborhood. I believe that's the Subura on the other side of the forum. The important thing here is the temple itself is the temple to Mars Ultoris. So remember, Mars is the god of war, and of course, this is a dictator, a ruler who warred all the time. He was a great general himself, as was his predecessor Julius Caesar. But the other important thing is remember the balance between war and love, or war and peace. So we have in the Julian temple, we have Venus as the goddess, Venus Genetrix, the goddess being honored. Here we have Mars being honored. And then, by the way, presumably what is also being honored here on the left in these colonnades is the Julian family. So in some ways, Augustus completes or continues the story of the powerful Julian family in these two fora. And that is the temple of Mars Ultoris today. So again, it's a ruin. It's a temple that was very, very large, that sat up high on a platform with a great staircase leading up to it, a beautiful Corinthian colonnade, a colonnade of columns in the Corinthian order. The backside abutted a neighborhood, and therefore there was a solid wall on the backside of this temple. And then the two colonnades, which are no longer here, are just remnants of them. You see the columns there on the left and right, but those ran to the left and right of the temple. And there, again, you see it in this larger map of the Forum. And here what you see is, in fact, the Roman Forum at its apogee in the 4th century. So we have the Colosseum at the very end of it, the Capitoline Hill at the other, and then the Forum of Julius to the northeast. And then we have the Forum of Augustus beyond that, and then the later four that will grow around those two. But I want to point out here a very important monument that was built by Augustus in honor of Julius Caesar, and he built it right smack in the heart of the Roman Forum, and that's the Temple of the Divine Julius. And that's what you see there in red, right in the middle of the Via Sacra. It interrupts the Via Sacra. Presumably that was an open space that led up to the temples below the Capitoline Hill that you see there, and the rostrum where the speakers used to speak. And it was in that very important path, that ceremonial pathway for processions, for parades, etc., where Caesar was cremated and where his remains were placed. And it was there where people worshiped the divine Caesar. And that little temple that you see here in these reconstructions was built by Augustus. So they're looking now south along the Via Sacra in the image on the upper left, looking past the Temple of the Vestals, etc., looking past later or earlier additions to the Roman Forum. You're on the Via Sacra, and it's interrupted now by the Temple of Julius Caesar, a very, very important placement. It also faces back to the Capitoline, and it faces north up to the Julius Caesar's Forum. So it's a very, very important location for Augustus to honor his deceased predecessor. Oops, I meant to go forward here. And these are, again, modern reconstructions in 3D up in the upper left, and actually this is also a digital reconstruction on the lower right. And there was, in fact, a little semicircular area cut into the platform or the base of this dual ramp or dual staircases that led you up to the temple proper. And in that semicircular space, there was an altar where offerings could be made to the divine Caesar. Here's another reconstruction of it on the lower right, drawing of that reconstruction. And again, the map that shows you that little temple in the lower right-hand corner of that diagram along the Via Sacra, where Caesar's remains were placed. And this is the ruins of it seen from the south, from the air. Actually, it's seen from the Palatine Hill looking down on it. Not much left there, but you can still see that semicircular area with the altar. It's been covered over with that copper roofing there. But that was an all-important altar where people could actually leave offerings or make offerings to the divine Julius Caesar. And there you see it again, the detail of that map. It's a floor plan. And I also want to bring back this coin that shows you Caesar Augustus on one side. What's interesting on the other is what's stated on the other side. You have this image of a flame, a kind of star-like pattern, and it says Divus Iuliu. And that is a reference to the divine Julius. It's a reference to Augustus as divine, but a reference to Julius Caesar, the divine one, as well. So that concept of like these were not just great men, mortals, they were also divinities. That idea commences here with Caesar and with Augustus, and it really commences with Augustus, who seemed to be all about promoting the power of his family, the legacy of his family, the role that this family played, and also their accomplishments, but also their divinity. And on the note of their accomplishments, I want to point out this monument. This is actually in Ankara, Turkey, so in Asia Minor, but it's an Augustan building. And what's interesting about it is it has this incredible plaque, which is the Res Augusti. These are the achievements of Augustus. This is a celebration, a written celebration of all the great achievements of Caesar Augustus, mainly his military exploits, but also the way he stabilized the empire, the way he expanded the empire, the way that he created a Pax Augusti, an Augustan peace in the Roman Empire. Okay, and then another very, very important monument. We're coming to the close here very quickly, but I want to point out these very important monuments. Again, this was an emperor who seemed to, both in his likeness, but also in his constructions, his architectural constructions, to honor his family, but also to propagandize about the power of his rule. This is known as the Ada Pacis Augusti, and this is an open air monument, an altar, a sacrificial altar that he erected on the Campus Martius up on the northern side of the city. So on the other side of the Capitoline Hill, in the fields where the military kept open for the army to train, for its encampments and that sort of thing. He built a monument up there. That monument, by the way, was moved in the 1930s and rebuilt by Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, who was a great admirer of the first dictator, Caesar Augustus. And this was the building that the building has been in for most of the 20th century and into the 21st century. This was built in the 1930s. A marble mausoleum-like structure to protect the Ada Pacis Augusti, this altarpiece. That recently was pulled down and a new building was built, and this is the Museum of the Ada Pacis that you see today. The Romans don't like this building at all. I mean, most Romans don't like it. Some people say it looks like a car dealership rather than a museum. Other people preferred the fascist monument to this thing, but nevertheless, it is a more generous climate-controlled structure for the building that's inside, for the structure that's inside, which was originally an open-air altarpiece where sacrifices could be made to the gods and specifically to honor the family of Augustus. It's a marvelous, beautiful structure made in marble, probably carved by a Greek sculptor. It's a very fine level of carving. A lot of it is abstract. A lot of it is just ornamentation, like the foliation that you see at the base. But it does have a set of panels, or relief panels, that show figures. So here we have a procession of figures. Among them is Augustus and his family on the back side. And there you see them up on the upper left-hand side, some of the children of the family. And then on the right, you have an image of Augustus right in the middle, and then Livia behind him, and one of her two sons, the little boy that you see sort of clutching the robes of Augustus. They seem to be in procession as the first family, as maybe even as the priestly family in this case. So the monument is indeed a monument to his rule and to the role that the family plays in maintaining the peace and the order of the state, and also as a good old Roman family continuing the traditions of the aristocratic families of Rome, the old families. There is a marvelous representation, a carving on one of the sides of the Ada Pacis Augusti, and that's the image that you see here. This is an allegorical figure. It's not a real person. It's an allegory of Tellus, or Mother Earth. And Tellus is shown as a kind of large, corpulent Roman matron, a beautiful, youthful woman at the prime of life, nurturing or even beginning to suckle these two babes. So she becomes almost a kind of allegory of the concept of charity or motherhood, surrounded by images, natural images, so the bounty of the earth, its plants, its animals, surrounding her, the earth mother herself, the goddess Tellus. If this image looks familiar to you, this idea of a mother holding a child, maybe holding two children, surrounded by a cow and sheep, etc., it's because the early Christians appropriated this image. They used it for images of Mary holding the infant Jesus, and sometimes holding the infant John, surrounded in the stable of that early Christian narrative. So it's an image that early Christians adopted from the pagan Romans, and maybe even specifically from this image on the popular public monument of the Ada Pacis Augusti. And again, as with the other sculpture, remember that this thing was brightly painted. It was actually colorful. And if you go to the museum today and you see it, they do a display where they actually project the original colors onto the monument It doesn't damage it because it's a projected image, but you can actually see a light show in which the monument comes to life as the Romans would have seen it. And there's another digital reconstruction of the colored panels as another historian envisions it in antiquity. But there is another monument associated with the Autapakis Augusti, and that's an obelisk that together the two of them formed an ensemble. And this is known as the Orologium Augusti, that is the clock of Augustus. The obelisk was an Egyptian obelisk brought to Rome, erected by Augustus near the Via Flaminia in the Campus Martius, on axis with the Autapakis. And on certain days of the year, actually all year long, that obelisk would form the gnomon of the gnomon of the clock, and you could actually know what time of day it was and what season we were in based on where the shadow of this obelisk was. But it did something interesting to the Autapakis Augusti. For many years, scholars believed that on September 23rd, which is the date of the autumnal equinox, and also incidentally Augustus's birthday, it's believed that the obelisk cast its shadow right on the Autapakis. Well, there's another scholar today, Naza, who actually says that that's incorrect, that the shadow actually crosses on October 9th, and that's the feast of Apollo Palatine, another important god in the pantheon. But let me show you some images of how that relationship. And of course, the problem is that both monuments have been moved over the last few centuries, and you can credit a bunch of popes for that. But none of the monuments are where they were originally on the Campus Martius, near the Via Flaminia. But actually, this is a reconstruction of what some scholars actually believe was true, that on a special day, the sun would in fact rise in the east and set on the west, and cast a shadow right across the Autapakis Augusti from the obelisk. Well, actually, you can see the Via Flaminia coming down from the north through across the Campus Martius, and that's the area of in the upper part of your screen, you can actually see where the obelisk and the Autapakis once stood. And not far from that, along the Tiber River, and this is the final monument we'll discuss, is the mausoleum of Augustus. So he was laid to rest not far from his monument, his orologium, and in this structure that you see here today, a circular cylindrical form with inner chambers, and it was there where his remains were laid to rest, not in the Roman Forum, not in a temple, but in this mausoleum, a dedicated circular structure for his tomb. And that mausoleum, incidentally, has just recently reopened to the public. It's been fully restored and excavated, and there are displays there now about Augustus's reign and about his rule and about his death and his remains, which are interred in this building. And on that note, we will end today's conversation, and we'll pick up the discussion of what happens to the Julian clan and the heirs of Augustus in ruling the state of Rome. Thank you. Don't forget to like us on YouTube. This will be posted shortly, and I hope to see you at our next presentation.